All right, we're here. We are back with more Dissecting Deus Ex. I'm here with Steve, and we are planning on just having a conversation about some final thoughts on Deus Ex in general, some of the latest news that has come out of lately. We really want to talk about Warren Spector's postmortem at GDC this year, and just some final thoughts about the series as well, because we're never done talking about Deus Ex.
It's endlessly dissecting Deus Ex.
Just constantly.
Yeah, EDDDX.
Oh, God. Make the acronym so long. Yeah. Maybe we can just jump right into Warren Spector's talk, because I think that he covers, obviously, a lot of information that we, didn't have access to before. I think there was actually some things he said. He's like, I've never said this before on record. So it was a very illuminating speech, and we'll link it in the bottom so you guys can watch it too. It's about an hour, but it's really worth your time if you're interested in Deus Ex or just game design.
Yeah, game design in general. There's a lot of useful advice in there for game designers, and every process is different, but it seemed like this one had its own unique path through, and I think there's a lot of things that will help inform your understanding of Deus Ex, but also where it was headed originally and then now where it's at as a final product.
Yeah, and I think there was a lot of things that he said in his talk that really resonated with some of the things we were saying in the video too, which is always nice when you're validated by the designer himself and you're like, yes, we weren't just grasping at straws or whatever.
We have a direct mental connection with Warren Spector now.
Right,
That's what we've learned. Yeah, we're on the same wavelength, everything.
Yeah. And he's a really great speaker. He had that vest on. I don't know. I was just like, he evokes dad. He's like, he's really tried hard not to swear, and he's being
lots of his meme game was very daddish.
Yeah, exactly. One of the major things that resonated with me, because I watched it and I took notes, because that's what we do as academics, is we take notes for everything. And he talked about his key design philosophies, and he called it the 6+2+1. And I didn't understand that breakdown completely.
I don't think he understood the breakdown.
I think it's just something that maybe he wants to coin. He's like, yes, this is mine. I am not calling it 9. I will call it this. But basically one of the things he wanted to talk about was how designers incorporate messages into their games. So he, I think, said, if you don't have a message in your game, you should stop making games. He said that a bunch. He was like, you need to stop doing this if you're not putting a message in your game.
It's very clear that he's frustrated with where AAA games at least are headed. He didn't talk much about indie games, which might indicate where he gets his source of games from. But I totally on board with that criticism. He says he's done, if you're making a game about a space marine and a shotgun, stop doing what you're doing, because we have enough of those. Fans of the new Doom might disagree, but I'm 100% on board with that message. Let's explore new ground. Let's ask questions that haven't been asked before, and that's where he was getting at with that kind of line of talking about the game and saying do something that you're passionate about, that you can explore yourself as you develop this game too. I think was part of that underlying message. Yeah,
he did say Deus Ex was his dream game.
Yeah, which is, it just kind of came out of nowhere when he was invited to that studio by John Romero to do exactly that, build your dream game.
Yeah.
Which is he still hasn't been able to do that since, it sounds like. It's a kind of once in a lifetime opportunity.
And probably something that, to be quite frank, doesn't really happen anymore. I don't think. No. Not nowadays with the amount of control that the studios have.
Yeah, the kind of risk aversion and the needing to work with proven formulas and stuff like that. Well, I guess if you're a white male, then you got better chances than most. There's a great interview with the people that worked at Looking Glass, and Ken Levine's one of them, and they're about an hour long each. And maybe we can link to that too in the comments, or in the info below. But it just details how Ken Levine went from working in law to just basically showing up at a game studio and saying, hey, I want to give this a whirl. And they said, welcome aboard. And that's how he got his start. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically it. And I think he's very aware that you couldn't do that today. But that's where a lot of the kind of what we think of as the kind of core group of people that really ushered in at least the era of immersive sim games, and games like BioShock and System Shock, Thief, Deus Ex, they're all kind of in the same realm. all kind of came from this stable of people that they worked hard, but they still benefited a
They
lot
were from the ground up, came in and was able to. I just can't even imagine any industry nowadays where you can just walk in and be like, hi, like, I'm working for you now. I have this idea, right? And even Warren Spector says, like, I have ideas. I have 300 ideas for games right here. That's not enough.
Yeah, it reminds me of that Thomas Edison line about vision without execution is just hallucination.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right. It's about seeing things through, because things will change as you try to implement them, and that's kind of where the real artistry comes, is being able to adapt your ideas to suit the constraints of the medium you're working with. And I think that's what that hour-long video was like, how do we take this thing that we want to represent the real world, we want to show like a realistic depiction of it, and that's largely the trajectory of the first Deus Ex, is realizing, oh, we can't do that, the technology's not there, it's not as fun to do. And then that's when they actually started projecting further into the future to give themselves some creative leeway in terms of the setting and creating environments that were a little more desolate, which is what kind of the narrative behind Deus Ex allows you to do. Is there's martial law, so you don't have to have the streets populated with people and shops open because things are kind of under lockdown in New York, and those types of things kind of working together to basically make up for the fact that the Unreal Engine wasn't that powerful.
Oh, and it's that typical creativity under restriction.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? You get most creative when you have to work around these things. Going on this idea of the real world is not fun concept, there's this element where you agree with him in that, yes, like when you just try to recreate real life, you're not getting a fun experience that anyone wants to enjoy. But I think there's a question of like, which lives are you depicting, right? So we talked about Life is Strange a little bit, which does have fantastical elements to it, but at its core is just like high school life.
Yeah, with the option to do a do-over.
Right.
For some of your interactions with your friends.
Which you could do students. Manually. People have been doing, Warren Spector talked about that. He's like, I was testing these games. People would want to see every option, and he wasn't a huge fan of that, but that's our instinct, is to like see what are best mid-max, right? And like decide which min-max.
I was going to say
mid
to max.
Mid to max.
There's no min here.
No mins allowed. To see which options you like the best, and
it handled real life depiction in a way that was like outside of the excessive use of the word hella. It was pretty spot on in terms of like it's how it depicted interpersonal relationships in high school and what a young woman into photography would be doing and exploring and interested in, and like that's. You don't see that level of attention to the social realism versus the technological realism.
Or like Sybil is another example. Completely realistic game. It's a personal game. It's an autobiographical game in some ways. Still talking about a lot of the same things.
Yeah. He hit a lot of notes that were like, okay, we've heard this a lot in the past 15, 20, 30 years about games. What I really loved about that talk, and I'm pretty sure I've heard him mention this before, is that he got into game design through Dungeons and Dragons. But so, which a lot of people focus on him from a mechanical perspective, because you see the mechanics of D&D built into video games, either in foreground or in the background. But he was like, no, it's what I wanted. What inspires me as a game designer is to try and recapture that sense of collaborative storytelling. That's what it was all about, was getting that feeling of a group of friends together and a game master, and trying, you propose something, and then you roll a die, do your stat check, but also the GM's there to see is that feasible or not, and trying to capture that sense of exploration and collaboration is essentially what he said has been driving him ever since.
Well, and actually speaking about roles, like the die element was the one thing that he derided in his talk. He said role play, ROLE, not ROOL. I don't understand why people are still making games where you have to, based on like a roll of a dice.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's interesting because if you're into like tabletop and board games, he kind of casts some shade your direction.
Yeah. Or
even though he has that D&D background, or that has inspired him, he casts some shade there.
Or basically any Western RPG, Western like isometric RPG still uses, MMOs still use it.
Yeah.
Where you're rolling die, and I don't know. That was interesting. He has a lot of very specific opinions about those kind of things.
Yeah. But like I like the way that they implemented RPG into Deus Ex. Like this really would bother people today. But the fact that if you're untrained in the pistol and you go to look down the sights, it's your aim is just all over the place, and which reflects the fact that you're not trained on how to actually hold that gun, and that forces you to adapt and maybe either up that skill or focus on the skills that you've already invested in. And I thought that was a cool way of implementing that. And nowadays, like you just wouldn't see that kind of forced control over, especially something like about your aiming.
Especially in shooters, where like shooters have become the epitome of like accuracy, skill, player control, and it's up to the person to train themselves to be good at shooting, whether it be through like this optimizing your settings and finding a system that works for you. So in that element, it's really funny how, not funny, the narrative elements are the personal elements, the mechanical elements are the character elements, which is usually the opposite of how RPGs go, right? Like the character is the character and they are who they are, and you know, you're immersive sim, but like you're not thinking about these political elements, these narrative elements in your personal moral compass. And it's the mechanical elements that are usually like, if I just keep playing, I'll get better type thing. Those are based on the realities of the character and how much points you put into things, not necessarily like, I just will aim better.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Physically.
Yeah. Well, and it like levels the playing field too, right? Like you can't come into that game and already have like the Twitch shooter skill set kind of muscle memory built into your body. You would need to actually level your character up to reflect that skill that you have in the outside of the game, which I think is a nice way to try and essentially level the playing field across all players, and also open up the game to exploring different paths as well, going down those routes.
Oh, and that was exploring other paths was another major thing he talked about, and how years later people are still going up to him and telling him about a new route they found or something or other. I would like to think some of those are a little based on bugs or like mechanical blips or whatever, but that's the most exciting thing for him, is the conversations that are had around the game and player experiences being different, as opposed to just like being like a one and done sort of experience.
Yeah, and like that's at certain points when he's talking, I'm just nodding my head, because I'm like, those are the types of games I like too. Like I like games that really, you play them and you feel a really strong urge to tell somebody about that experience of playing that game. Those types of experiences, I think, which immersive sim as a genre really lends itself to. But so many immersive sim games, and like by that we mean like games like BioShock and System Shock, games that try to have a lot of the experience be more of a sandbox one, where you're exploring how things work within that world and developing solutions based on those mechanics. Those are so often about the like stacking certain set of boxes to find an access to a different route, or using a gun to shoot off a lock to get into a different area or something like that. Whereas in Deus Ex, I feel like it's the paths you're exploring are can be much more social and political and ethical,
right, yeah,
than they are just sort of mechanical workarounds.
Well, and even just the idea that like this playthrough, I decided to sit around and talk to this character for like way more than I ever thought that I would, and I learned a new dialogue thing, which could have informed, part of like the overall decision you make at the end of the game.
Yeah, like Hunter, the fact that Gunther, the fact that he has a kill phrase that you can utter to him, because he's arguably one of the harder bosses in the game, because he's just so jacked. And I mean, what are you going to do about that? But if you talk to Jaime Reyes, the physician who works at your the company you start working for, you eventually build up that relationship, and he reveals that there's this kill phrase. And when you do have that final showdown with Gunther, you can it becomes a dialogue option, and you can, if you're playing in a non kind of violent, or at least a non-combat playthrough, that's a really cool thing. It's not obviously there for you either. You have to engage socially with people in your environment and in a way gain their trust, and then those options become available to you. And that's the kind of multi-layered depth that I really like. It's not about, I found a new route. It's about, I found new connections. I discovered new relationships, and the game really lends itself to that kind of repeated playthrough, that kind of depth.
Or if you compare it to something like in the Bethesda games, where you just level up your speech a bunch, like the Fallout games, you just, as long as you put enough skill into your talking, then you can say the one thing that ends the mission non-violently. And it's like, I see, like, it's nice to do that and have that option, but it is so less involved, because immediately, like, you're just picking that one choice and you're not learning anything about the world or the characters. You press the button and then the thing happens.
Yeah. So like if you go back to the Dungeons and Dragons connection, it's like, which those types of relationships, that type of gameplay is just something that's too sophisticated for computers to handle.
Mm-hmm.
So one way you can go about doing it is to try to create a world that's the immersive sim approach, where it's those things can maybe happen organically or maybe not, versus like the Bethesda Fallout, Elder Scrolls approach is to go, let's take a subset of those types of interactions and build them into the game, and then design that so players can level up skills to pursue those different paths. So trying to anticipate it versus letting it happen organically. And I think that, yeah, letting it happen organically is much closer to trying to get that essence of that experience of stories that you're collaboratively telling each other, versus a story that's pre-planned out for you, and you might have the stats or not to actually see it through.
Yeah, and it definitely leads to more player conversation after the fact, right? Like, no one is going to be like, oh, I did the quest and I did the speech option. And then, well, I mean, sometimes you ask, like, oh, what happens if you do the speech option? And it's like, oh, you just get some extra credits. Or like, you don't have to kill them and then they go off on their way.
Yeah, well, and I think that's something that actually Life is Strange did really well, because I definitely, so they especially with Life is Strange, what they did is they built in that pick an option or save, follow a path, see if it's the one you want, reload, follow the other path, and then go with the best choice. Whereas Life is Strange, that's the mechanics of the game, is rewinding.
Yeah.
So when you go to these conversations and you hit a branching choice, it'll even tell you, like, hey, do you want to rewind and pick something else? And it anticipates that by allowing you to get enough of a, okay, this will change this relationship a little bit, but I still don't know how this is going to play out in the long term.
Yeah.
And then you have Max's, the main character's inner monologue, she's constantly questioning, was that the right choice? She's not a confident person. And that lack of confidence is a great, not only does it kind of match well with a high school student, it also matches well with your player's perspective. Is that the same? Is that how I actually want to proceed here? And I think there are much better ways, much more organic ways to work in these types of scenarios, rather than the kind of, I would say it's kind of ham-fisted at this point to try and trying to hard-code it in that way. But,
yeah, exactly. One of the other things about conflict and discussion that Spector talks about is this idea that of people and politics, and he talks a lot about the game being about having a discussion about the fate of the world, and that is the point of the game, not killing this boss, saving the princess. And
it's really like the fate of the world versus saving the world.
Yes, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, those are two completely different questions that you would be asking of your player. Yeah. And
ultimately, because he talks about how he has that discussion in the bar where the guy says, this is right-wing trash. The other guy says it was left-wing propaganda from the beginning. And he says they're both right because they played the game differently. And that was their perspective, and that was how they made their decisions and whatever. So it's, again, we talk about this a lot in episode 9, I believe, Paris Catacombs, where we talk about, again, how the political beliefs of the characters suss out or bring out the political beliefs of the person. But it's so telling that a game can accommodate all political opinions, like in that, not all political opinions, but there's a spectrum.
Yeah. And right from the get-go, right? Like there's the terrorists, the NSF, National Secessionist Forces, which are ostensibly from the start of the game, that's who you're going to be up against for the entirety of the game. That's who you think the villain is. They're anti-government. They think that they'll call you a fascist because they think you work for the state. That's one of their in-game barks. That's not quite the full breadth of who you're up against. And even within that own group, there are people who are deeply racist. They're still involved with this group, and even though they're kind of pushing back against the kind of state control, they're pushing back against it for reasons that, like, from today's perspective, would be different from their own. So I think that was interesting too, in terms of the politics of that.
And another thing he talks about is the politics and people being something that players usually don't have a chance to have control over, both in other games and in real life. And I think that was part of the thrill of it all, I think, for them when they were initially designing it, is just having this option where it's like, hey, you've killed aliens before. And it's funny how he talks about killing aliens, because you do it at the end of Deus Ex anyways.
Well, they're not. Yeah.
Oh,
are they aliens?
Okay, well, bird people and whatever. Not bird people. Birds, things, and blah, blah, blah. But anyways, the overall idea that you're influencing people in politics over just killing things, and giving people that mobility where, you know, and again, such a resonant statement to make nowadays, where the hopelessness of democracy and politics has kind of led everyone to be thinking this way lately. Just resonates in a game that, again, is 17 years old now, and you still don't see a lot of games where politics and people are the primary objective, or
they're inflexible.
Yeah.
Too. The politics are usually set, and you're playing within those politics. Versus in Deus Ex, it's asking you to interpret those politics and make value judgments about them, and then use that to change the course of your actions throughout the game. So they essentially put politics into play. Yeah. Versus a lot of other games, politics are the framework within which you're going to work. Which I think, like, a lot of kind of BioWare games actually follow that pattern, like Knights of the Old Republic, the light and dark meter and stuff like that.
Well, Dragon Age does it a lot too.
Mass Effect, I think, as well. Mass Effect is a deeply political game, because you're coming up against this kind of council and trying to prove that humans belong to be part of this kind of this intergalactic political group. But that's a kind of framework within which you operate. You're not really able to question the motives of that organization, or change that structure, or affirm it in any kind of way. It's just kind of taken for granted.
Well, and it undermines itself in Mass Effect 2, where you suddenly again become this like puppet of the Invisible Man, and you're just going along with whatever. And you have, and that's like the moment that killed it for me with Mass Effect, was when you're in front of the council again, and you don't have the option to say like, I am being held against my will, or like, I don't agree with these people. And because you don't get to say that undermines every political thing that happens in the first game. Yes. And, you know, it's not like you had a lot of mobility in the first game anyways, but at least they were getting at something there. And then you're suddenly not the same Commander Shepard that you initially thought you were.
Yeah, and that's sort of interesting, like the politics of dissent too, right? Which you have that right from the get-go in Deus Ex, because they're telling you, your bosses are telling you, your coworkers are telling you, for the most part, take the lethal option, wipe these guys out. Their lives are worthless. They've thrown their lives away because they've backed this kind of political movement that's against our outlook. So, you know, weapons loose type thing. Versus if you do listen to some people like your brother, or the ex-sergeant who's working in the munitions office, it's about questioning that approach and exercising your dissent to those orders, and you get reprimanded for it. Within the kind of in-game narrative of you're working for this United Nations organization, versus, in a way, having your bosses reprimand you for doing the right thing is an affirmative thing, especially in a kind of like punk context, or like at least an anti-authority context, is saying, okay, great, I don't like you guys, so I'm glad that you're mad with me. I'm glad I'm not doing things the way you want them to be done, especially in this very violent and unethical way.
And so meta if you think about the journey that Warren Spector had to go on as well, where he talks about how so many people told him, just make a shooter. And you think about it, that's very indicative of the boss, you know, Manderley telling you just like kill people. It's like, no, I want to give players the option to do either or. I am not making a shooter. I'm making my immersive sim, and thank you very much. And we'll go about your business. But we can jump into like a little bit more of the punk stuff, because we've talked about before how Deus Ex is kind of this hallmark game of the cyberpunk genre.
Got the leather trench coats.
Yeah.
Sunglasses at night.
Right.
It's got, you know, all the
cybernetics and
cybernetics.
CD bar.
Yeah.
I mean, the bar's not that seedy. It just looked very clean to me.
Actually, yeah, because they probably couldn't populate it with much stuff. Yeah.
I mean, that's like that's the main influence right there for the other Deus Ex games. We want to put everything. We want garbage everywhere.
Yes, they love clutter in the new ones. Yeah, which I'm kind of on board with, because especially if you're doing like environmental storytelling, That's one thing that came out with like both of Adam Jensen's apartments in the past, the two games that have come out of Montreal, where those are, you can spend half an hour poking around that apartment, looking at all the different details and
cereal boxes,
all the cereal boxes. Yeah.
You think of the Denton characters and you think about their place within Cyberpunk, and it really doesn't match the genre, the typical genre of the characters you see coming out of them, because they're high class guys. They got apartments in New York that, well, JC shares it with his brother. We still don't really know what's happening there.
to be fair, I guess that's not a great apartment.
I mean, but yeah, that's true.
They're staying in the Hilton Hotel with a sign that's dilapidated. And
yeah, but it's in New York. The real estate in New York. That's what you get nowadays.
That's what $1 million salary gets you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but they're clearly coming from like a middle class family. They've had a pretty, not a charmed upbringing because it was pretty traumatic in a lot of respects. But
he went to boarding school.
They were fairly well looked after. And yeah, there's a great article that came out a couple weeks ago on PC Gamer on essentially arguing that we need more punk in our Cyberpunk games. Because if you look at the recent run of Cyberpunk games, it's been largely not... So the article starts out with this great quote from a science fiction author who says that Cyberpunk is high tech meets low class. So essentially, those who are disenfranchised by how high tech is produced in a lot of respects. Kind of like the Silicon Valley critique of they're not really trying to solve problems, but they do present all of their products as solutions to problems, whether you actually have them or not. Meanwhile, we have these social political issues or problems that already exist that Silicon Valley is able to essentially profit off of by not addressing, and like things like income inequality and that sort of thing as well. So.
And you'd like to think Mankind Divided kind of tried to get at that as a major part of their narrative, but ultimately you're still, from Adam's perspective, and he's kind of this middle ground between like the OGs and the corporations, and he fits into this narrative in a very specific place. And I don't think, and it doesn't really end up representing either. In a way,
no, he's kind of just a middle to upper class outsider, as opposed to the punk genre should really be by the those that are kind of down and out, that see these power structures from a different perspective and takes on it. Their resistance to those power structures is a lot different than it is for somebody who's already got a stable income and doesn't have to worry about being able to put food on the table,
right? Versus
somebody who's living hand to mouth. That if they can just afford to upgrade their computer, they can kind of get back into the hacking game and maybe make ends meet type thing. That's a very different perspective.
Or even biologically, right? You find a lot of these characters are struggling with the technology they have. So, I mean, no real point in Deus Ex do you run into major issues with your augments. Like maybe in like Human Revolution a little bit.
They definitely try in Human Revolution because they have that. If you do the upgrade, your AUGs shut down.
Yeah.
And that boss fight, when that happens, can be really challenging if you hadn't.
It's a minor inconvenience at best,
yes,
and not a main point of the struggle of the game, where people are dealing with skin grafting issues or corrosion of the body and all those kind of cyberpunk concerns that come out. And I guess you could argue that JC is, because he's disenfranchised, or I guess you can choose to have him more disenfranchised than not, that he has that perspective of that's typical of the cyberpunk genre, and being able to, but again, he has the mobility to be able to go to all these different places and talk to all these people and infiltrate these spaces in ways that end up being very easy for him if you think about it in terms of narratively, as opposed to like someone who's got to cobble something together and is not going to smash the state on his own. You know what I mean? It's a collective thing.
Yeah. Well, and that comes down to the design too, because of how typical AAA game views their player is it's power fantasy. It's about presenting you with a complete range of options. So if you want to be kind of fascist JC Denton, you can kind of do that, right?
Yeah.
So does that... How cyber is it versus how punk is it? And I don't. Can you really call it a cyberpunk game if it's so open to being something that just reinforces exactly what punk would be resistant to?
Exactly.
Right. That's the kind of thing that like I kind of worry about when you talk about when AAA game developers talk, because they're always talking about empowering the player. Punk is often about people who are disempowered. Are those types of characters quote unquote fun to play as? They could be. I just don't think enough games really explore that perspective, because they want to give their players the utmost freedom that they can, and in their mind that means the ability to get new powers without having to give anything up, or about going on these kind of fantastical globe-trotting missions where you get to determine the fate of the world. Arguably a cyberpunk story isn't necessarily that epic. It sometimes is more mundane, because that's kind of the world that or the perspective that cyberpunk takes to kind of critiquing power and its distribution.
And that's why I'm nervous about the CD Projekt Red Cyberpunk game, because I'm seeing that as, again, a very cyber as opposed to punk world. Again, obviously we haven't seen a lot about it, but I think we're both probably pretty excited for the game. But being that it's like going to be this large scale game, you really wonder what they're going to do with that, because the open world, I think it's open world, right? It's supposed to be open world.
My vision is that it's like Witcher,
but yeah, that's what I've been thinking too.
Which I'm like, all right, let's do that, especially after Witcher 3.
Yeah, absolutely. But you wonder like if open world games lend themselves to cyberpunk based on the just general mobility that you have as a character.
Well, one of the things that worked really well in a game like Witcher 3 is that, like, or at least in my opinion, is the frame of you're a kind of wandering sellsword you're the only one that's really able to rid these towns and villages of these kind of demons that haunt them. And so the whole quest system of going to one place and picking up a quest and solving it is already baked into the narrative of the game.
Yeah.
They kind of reinforce one another, which I think really that makes that world much more cohesive, and that allows Geralt to be who he is without us kind of questioning it.
Yeah.
And so it'll be really interesting to see if they're able to do that with Cyberpunk 2077. Is kind of can they do something similar with making that narrative in the world reinforce one another and still be punk?
Right.
Because I think you work as part of an organization in that game. It might even be a police organization. Or something.
I remember thinking of Ghost in the Shell a lot too when I was initially reading about the game. But I mean, we'll see. I guess I don't know. When I think of Cyberpunk game, for some reason my mind goes to Jet Set Radio, because that is like a very like simple game where you're disrupting very small elements of the world, and you're not making a huge impact, but you're just kind of annoying people by spray painting stuff. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's just that simple. So I thought we could also talk a little bit about the Dissecting Deus Ex project a little. Dissecting Deus Ex has really been an interesting project into seeing how you can do academic commentary in a video form, but not entirely a full Let's Play. And I think overall, it's a very good formula that worked really well for Deus Ex because of a lot of the fat that's in that game that, is just not interesting, or the amount of lull in the game where there's not too much to say about it. And I think a long form Let's Play would be not only time consuming, but not beneficial to either the person doing it or the audience, because, you really want to get clean, edited down videos, which obviously is not something I did completely. We're still working on it, but I think it worked really well for getting our point across and just being able to have something where people could look up very easily. Like you can, by sorting by level, you can kind of get this quick and easy answer to a potential question you might have about, a specific part of the game, instead of like siphoning through this like hour to 2 hour long video that covers a bunch of stuff at once. But I'm curious to see what you thought of the overall project and kind of how you thought it went, or if there's something that you thought worked or didn't work.
Yeah, I think that the game really lent itself to this approach, right? Because part of, I think, what appealed to both of us was just that, unlike most other games, Deus Ex engages with mature material and not just a kind of mature theme that's populated with immature interactions. Like they're citing people like Foucault and Bakhtin and Aquinas, and like there's a lot of the writing behind the game was coming from a place that's kind of well read in terms of the material it wanted to deal with. Whereas I get the sense with a lot of other games, and kind of not to single anybody out, but I guess I will, is like I find the more like Harvey Smith's games tend to be they take a lot of what worked in Deus Ex, but that level of maturity is not there at all. I don't find it's there in the setting, but it's not there in the actual interactions in the world. In terms of having these serious conversations about politics versus, you look at like Dishonored, you're dealing with the outcome of the politics. That's the world you're in. You're not actually have much say over it. I mean, look at Dishonored 2, you're kind of deposed empress. You're coming from a very wealthy family, and you're in the city where you're just pilfering everything you can find from already disadvantaged
very quickly in the game
people.
You go from like empress to scrounging in the streets, stealing alcohol from bars.
And maybe part of the reason why they don't address the politics in those games is because once you start head down that path, things start to unravel pretty quickly, and they look very much different from that perspective. Versus Deus Ex, I think, to a certain degree at least, can withstand the kind of scrutiny of the kind of conversations we want to have. There's a game journalist who has Heather Chaplin, who has this line: games themselves aren't immature, but game developers are.
Right.
And this was coming back out in the 2000s when it was really debatable about whether games, AAA or indie, could actually address a kind of serious theme, because there wasn't a lot of examples to point to, a lot of successes to point to. And I think that Deus Ex is part of that lineage of games that actually was, like I said this in the first episode, it was the first game that treated me as an adult. And I really appreciated that. And I don't feel like a lot of games treat me as an adult. Even though they're rated 18 plus, they're not really treating me in a way that thinks that I can rationally think about large issues and ethical issues and things that don't have easy answers. A lot of games are about easy answers, essentially. Do you want to choose the one that makes everyone happy, or do you want to choose the one to piss everybody off and be the kind of the roguish type character? So that, I think, from like a perspective of doing a Let's Play versus doing this kind of more, in a way, almost more curated approach, I think that we found something that could really back up that our kind of first foray into doing these types of commentaries.
Yeah, and I think obviously like the technicalities of doing this kind of thing was, I think, a big struggle just by the fact that Deus Ex is a very hard game to record. I know I've talked to some people or heard some people talk about not specifically doing Let's Plays of Deus Ex just based on the technicalities of getting that game running and recording, which is a shame. And, but what are you going to do about it? It's an old game. Most people are working off like the Steam port or whatever, the game of the year edition with some mods. Like we had the New Vision mod and maybe something else. I don't know. Probably it's all, it's bandaged together. And even then, like we still had audio issues that I didn't know existed until I started editing the video. Something to keep in mind is that we actually recorded everything all at once last summer of 2016.
Oh, boy.
I think we stopped in August. And so, right. Being busy and slow was part of it, but also just cobbling together all the pieces of things we had recorded was a big challenge. And for anyone that wants to do a Deus Ex video, I think you have to keep those things in mind because it's just a very unstable game.
Yeah, and it's a long game. It's 40 hours. So like our conversations around what do we want to highlight, what gives us the most to talk about, was another issue that kind of comes up. Like that would have been, if you're doing a Let's Play of that, how do you, there'd be a lot of not dull moments, but they wouldn't be very fun to watch.
Well, and there was so much that had to be cut out even from what we did play, especially the last level where we're like, where are we going? Let's no clip through everything because like I'm lost and this is crazy and things are just exploding and we're not really interested in talking about that. And we were lucky that I had various save files already through my playthrough on the computer, or else we would have had to have played through that entire game.
Yeah.
Or download
which
the save
we love
files.
Very much.
We love playing Deus Ex.
Don't have 40 hours.
We don't have 40 hours. Even Warren Spector was like, I talked to the guy who said he played it 63 times and I wanted him to go back to Germany.
Never run into him again.
Yeah, and never see him again, which I thought was a little mean.
I thought he did. Yeah, it was pretty mean. I think I've done 5 playthroughs probably.
I will play Human Revolution over Deus Ex 1 anytime, just based on the ease of access alone.
I like the first 20 hours of that game. I really like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was... And that's another game that's, I think, is quite interesting, that maybe warrants its own video.
So I think we'll end here with some concluding thoughts overall on the game in general, not necessarily the legacy, because that would involve talking about all the other games, and I don't have time to do that. There's a lot of stuff there. But I think one of the things that I want to get out from, going through and analyzing Deus Ex and talking about it and having kind of back and forth with some of you in the comments is that Deus Ex is a game that innovated beyond anything that people had seen before. And it was so bananas overall. Like, it was a bananas game, and there was lots of stuff cut out of the game, and they had 500 pages of notes for this game, and something like 30 characters designed before they had even started writing the story. And they just built this insane world. And so Deus Ex, although it's a huge game, is a very pared down version of the original vision. And that's something to be said, because I think nowadays we wouldn't have so much time and effort spent into building up such a thing. And Warren Spector talks about how the writing was a very important aspect of the game. And, he credits, one of, I think, four writers, I don't remember the number, but one of them having a dual degree, computer science and creative writing, from Harvard and another Ivy League school.
I guess Sheldon, maybe.
Yeah, and that's just insane. And an insane human person that has these degrees, you know what I mean? And just has such an ability, and and it shows in the game, and you have those talents working together, and they had a great team, and you wonder about people's visions and people's dreams when it comes to games that are being made. And Deus Ex is just such a unique case of coming from a creative person and a creative team that had the backing of a studio who were able to fund the project and also extend the development by a few years, even when they knew they weren't ready. And that's something to be acknowledged and respected. And I hope that there's more games to come out where, there's ideas and dreams are made into reality. But it's so indicative of the time. And so when people get disappointed by games nowadays, they have to contextualize it in the time. And having the stars aligning almost for this game to exist is just something that needs to be recognized. It's a legacy, and it's an era that is just we're not going to see again, I don't think.
Yeah, maybe we just have to count ourselves lucky that we got it at all.
Yeah,
as it is, and that because there's so much risk aversion, at least in AAA gaming, of towards trying out new mechanics. Like, a lot of games even today are just still taking what worked in System Shock and what worked in Deus Ex and iterating on it versus
Half-Life.
And then what actually made those games impactful was that they were innovative. So they're kind of undermining their own abilities to move the medium forward by just trying to build on the success of what's worked in the past. And that's something that, I think, could be a critical lens that could be brought to the new Deus Ex games in terms of what they added to the series was really cool. The whole idea of a social boss fight, I think, that's a really cool idea that completely changes how you conceive of the social interaction and how momentous that can be in a game. Usually those conversations are kind of an aside versus a kind of the climax of an interaction. But that was, to me, that was kind of that was probably the biggest new addition that they made. Yeah. And then they didn't iterate. They didn't even really develop much past that for the second one. So kind of my takeaway is just kind of, we should count ourselves lucky that we got something that was like this. And I really hope that there is room in the lives of game designers and writers to learn from what worked well here, which was, I think, like you mentioned, world building and attention to world building and the attention to detail there, but also work on what's already out there. Like they didn't set out to create a game about politics by knowing nothing about politics to begin with.
That's right.
They were citing philosophers and researchers and historians that spent their careers studying these topics and trying to work through them, and they used that as the basis through which they crafted their world and that through which they discussed politics. And I see no reason whatsoever to not have that knowledge informing games moving forward, because I think there's really a need to move from kind of immature interactions and mechanics to something more mature and something that, again, treats us as adults rather than just kind of big kids.
Yeah, and that's just the biggest sentiment, I think, to like end the whole series on. And just, again, when we talk about innovation, I think it's innovative thinking and not innovative technology. I think that's the biggest thing, because the technology wasn't there for Deus Ex to accommodate everything, but the innovative thinking that they did with their writing and their design is the thing that set them apart.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. They were able to adapt, and to a degree that those constraints led to a more interesting game. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that's what we have, and it feels kind of sad to end off the discussions, because I think we've been like at it for a while, but I hope you guys have enjoyed Deus Ex. We always like feedback. We're still new to the YouTube thing, but we hope to do more videos at some point. We're busy, but we'll try. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Won't make any promises, but we really enjoyed this, and we have already loved a lot of the feedback that you guys have given us and the conversations that have been happening, and you guys have been keeping the comment section fairly mature, which is nice.
Yes, yeah, and we definitely appreciate you following us through all the way to the end
as
well. Right? Yeah, you made it. And,
congratulations.
Yeah, we thank you for that, and we hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thanks.
Bye.